college classes where we go over the Beatles song Tomorrow Never Knows. We talk about some historical information, we talk about influences, and we talk about the production of some of the sounds. There's documents that you can take a look at on the screen, as well as audio examples. Anyway, if this video doesn't get blocked, it will certainly be demonetized. So I would greatly appreciate a thumbs up, a comment, maybe subscribe. And if you feel so inclined, there's a link in the description box where you can buy me a cup of coffee. Either way, thanks so much for watching, and let's get right into it. But the evolution of technology also changed the working methods of people creating music in box time, or in let's go like to pose for them, and they wouldn't play anything unless there was sheet music in front of them, and everything was a live performance. There were no recordings, right? None of that stuff. If you wanted to hear music, you had to hear it performed live. And then the first being able to record music, and then music became sold for entertainment, and people have performances played back in their home whenever they wanted to. They could hear it over the radio, right? And all this kinds of stuff. And then it was all about simultaneously while that was going on, and we discussed this in an earlier class when we were talking about the history of sampling. You had things like Pierre Schaeffer with all the tape splicing and things like that, and how, echo and all this stuff was being 60s, and the Beatles, they like the most successful act of the time, and they decided that the music that they had, first of all, they couldn't stand the screen older. They're not like 20 years old anymore, right? They're a little older, and they couldn't hear each other when they were playing, and they just didn't like being like having people chase them down the streets, like like the beginning of the Austin Powers film, or chasing him. That's like how the Beatles' life was, right? And so they decided to become then also it had become more using 4-track machines, and they started overdubbing and being able to play more sounds into a recording than of them could recreate live, right? And so they decided to become a studio band. And was that Abbey Road was owned by EMI/Parlophone, which was their record company. So they could take over a studio in Abbey Road Studios for months and months, and nobody was going to say anything because they were bringing in the most amount of money to the company. And it wasn't like they were paying money for the studio time. It was just a paper transaction within the company. Excuse me. There's that aspect of it. There's a fragment, not like Nelson Riddle coming in with an orchestration, and running it down, and then maybe him making some adjustments. Something wasn't right. He could change the whatever, something from trumpet to saxophone, right? Whatever. That's like minor little changes, but basically coming in with like a manuscript and a score, reading it down, getting it right, the articulation thing, and capturing a live performance, right? That's basically what everything had been up to that point. So they would come in with fragments of songs, and they would working out in various methods. So they would record like 3 or 4 instruments on one, like let's say the bass, the drums, and a piano and one guitar, and then then they'd have 3 other tracks to work with, and so then maybe they would overdub like some percussion on another track, and then another track maybe they would recrown vocals, and when they got to 4 tracks, they would use a second, and they would do a reduction mix from those 4 tracks down to 1 or 2 tracks of the second machine, and then they could do more recording. Now, they had the best quality machine. Going from tape machine to tape machine, you start losing the quality of the audio. And it's only been recently where they've been able to not erase the original tapes, right? So they could go back at some of the Beatles albums where they've been able to go back to the earlier tapes, record all that stuff into Pro Tools, line everything up, and do a proper mix that they couldn't do back then because they had, multiple, they would have all these reduction mixes aspect. And then you also had, in the 60s, London was the center of the avant-garde world. And, whilst like literally, like in Downton Abbey houses, Paul was living in London, and he was single, and he was Jane Astor, was that her name? Jane Astor? Of her parents in a flat above. He was going to hear guard music that were being performed by the orchestras. He was going to hear all the art galleries. And he started being, and there's this really famous photo, but there's a famous photo of one of Jimi Hendrix's earliest performances in London. And when you look in the background, you can see Paul McCartney at the gig, along with Pete Townsend of The Who and Mick Jagger, and they're all hanging out together watching Jimi Hendrix, like one of his first gigs. And this was right after Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club album came out, and Jim, the song Sgt. Pepper's, and he was playing it at the gig. So it's like literally a few days after the song came out. So Paul started being influenced by some of this, this Stockhausen, Karlheinz Stockhausen, and some of the tape loop experiments these people did. And these guys were wealthy enough, and they could get quarter-inch reel-to-reel machines at their house, and they could record stuff and create tape loops and bring them into the studio, and then they would be part of the recording, right? And so they were experimenting around with flying these sounds in to songs, or taking found music, which is similar to what you've been doing with some of your sound safaris, and editing these things up and flying them in. Like, in other words, you have the tape machine that's playing the song, and you have a second tape machine that you synchronize, and you play the song, and you're making a reduction mix onto a third machine. And when the time comes, you hit the play button on the second machine, and then the edit that you've just done gets mixed onto, let's say you've made a reduction down to 2 tracks. On the third track, you've got this edited. So we're going to take a look at of some of this stuff. So, the world of art and technology, it's sort of at that point in time, all sort of came together, and Larry Rivers was like in the middle of that. He became well known. Essential of all Beatles recordings is this Tomorrow Never Knows from the 1966 album Revolver. Let's make this big so you can see it. This is primarily written by John Lennon. There are numerous examples of creative recording and mixing techniques from the production of the song. Now, the Beatles also were heavily influenced by Indian music. There's a huge Indian population in London, and they all, George Harrison became really interested in Hinduism and Buddhism and Indian religion. India, that was a big part of the Beatles' story. For a month, to study with this Maharishi, and hip hop is just, it's an instrument that it has a big gourd and a neck, and then and you just sort of pluck the notes, and it creates this like sort of blooming and blossoming sound that creates a nice background pad for a lot of Indian music. And then if you see the classic Indian trio, it's a tambura player, a sitar player, and a tabla player, or a bansuri flute player and a tabla player, or a bansuri flute player, a sitar player, tabla player, and a drone. Lennon wanted the vocal for this. I didn't talk about this because we're in college, but the LSD was influenced song to sound like 100 chanting Tibetan monks and from the shouting doubt. And also, he wanted it to sound like the Dalai Lama being on the top of Mount Everest, or the Himalayas, as he would call it. So basically, Jeff Emmerich ran vocals, Lennon's vocals, a speaker and amplifier combination that's typically used on a Hammond organ to give sort of the swirling sound, because a Hammond organ is just a really dead sine waves, and they found that adding this effect it really helps to animate the sound. So basically, there are several components to this speaker. It's usually in a big wooden box, and the bottom of it has a woofer, like a 15-inch woofer, and then there's a drum that rotates around the woofer, and it dissipates. The treble has a pair of horns that rotate and shoot the sound out in a 360-degree fashion, and you can have it typically be rotating very slowly, or stopped, or rotating very fast. And that's like, knowing when to do these things if you're a Hammond player is a really essential part of playing a Hammond organ. They decided, John wanted this thing, and it was up to the engineers and at Abbey Road to figure out how to get the sound. And Jeff, the recording engineer, came up with this, and they needed to create some impedance matching boxes to make sure that the microphone would work with the speaker, because it's not meant for that. And so, they're creating technology that will eventually end up in software that we use today, like and guitar foot pedals that guitarists use all the time. It's all recreated digitally. That's one thing. And then, like, what they did typically at that time was they would record the vocals and then record it a second time to give it a doubling, a nice thickening of the vocal track. Lennon hated doing that. So then one of the assistant engineers, Ken Townsend, developed an automatic tracking, or ADT, a process in which the signal from the sync head of one tape machine was delayed through a second tape machine. And so the speed and the pitch was sort of modulated a little bit, and it sort of sounded like a doubled vocal. And you hear that all the time now. There's plugins that simulate that. It became, a standard procedure. Okay, so the other bit here is that McCartney, who had been influenced by Stockhausen and other music concrete composers, and we talked a little bit about this with Pierre Schaeffer, brought in a selection of quarter-inch tape loops he had recorded at home. The infamous Seagull sound is actually a sped-up recording of someone laughing. The other Beatles provided some home-recorded tape loops, which were ultimately played through various tape machines at Abbey Road, each supervised by technicians, with the band and George Martin manning the faders, right, to bring sounds in and out. And the loops were recorded on top of the existing arrangement. The other thing that they talk about here, that they don't talk about here, is that this is the first example of them flipping the tape over and playing it backwards, and then having George Harrison play a guitar solo to the backwards tracks, and then flipping the tape around so it's going the right way, and then having the guitar sound backwards, which, was like a psychedelic effect at the time. We did a live mix of all the loops, says George Martin, their producer, all over the studios. We had people spooling them onto machine with pencils, while Jeff Emmerich, the main engineer, did the balancing. There were many other hands controlling the panning. We had 5 machines running. It was totally done off the cuff. The control room was as full of loops as it was people. The last thing that I want to talk about, John said to me, I want this to sound as though I'm the Dalai Lama singing from the highest mountaintop, and yet I still want to hear the words I'm singing. And others recall that John also requesting the song have the sound of 4,000 monks chanting in the background. Oh, that's a lot of oming. Another distinctive element of Tomorrow Never Knows was Ringo's hypnotic drum sound. I moved the bass drum microphone much closer to the drum than it had ever been before. I stuffed that inside of the drum to deaden the sound. Then we put the sound through Fairchild 660 valve limiters and compressors. So you can really hear how the drums, and he's playing, it's almost like it's a loop. He's playing the same track, the same part for the whole song. It doesn't change. And it's really pumping because it's going through these valve limiters. There is a simulation of this. If you've got the full version of Pro Tools, it comes with it, digital simulation of this. One other thing I wanted to do as a tangential point that is relevant to this is that Indian culture and music was highly influential in the 1960s, right? The meditation, people started doing that. Eastern philosophy started becoming part of American consciousness. John Coltrane was highly influenced by Indian music. Ravi Shankar played at Woodstock. Coltrane actually has a song called India. Bum, 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 bum. Indian music was directly influential to popular musicians because, like I said, Ravi Shankar played at Woodstock. Think about that. And he played at the concert for Bangladesh, George Harrison, which was a huge event at the Madison Square Garden. Then Indian music influenced Coltrane with a lot of the stuff being modal on one chord, because with Indian music, the structure is not about, there's no harmonic activity. It's all about landing on the one and playing through the different scales and improvising and everybody being together, and like no matter how abstract the rhythmic aspect gets, but everybody knows where beat one is, and you can go to an Indian concert and see people counting beats on their fingers like this, it's really different. We'll listen to Ringo's drums. Right, that's the whole thing. Now these tracks are, they're extracted in a way that it affects the audio quality a little bit, but they're still incredibly invaluable for really dialing in to what was going on. Boom, boom, boom. And then McCartney's droning bass. Fuzz, right? And he's playing octaves. And then you've got some tape loops. Oh, this is that's the tambora. Seagulls, right? Somebody laughing, sped up. Some other weird sound. And then you had another track of that as well on the other side. Right, let's listen to both of these, this track and this track together. So, they had to tune all these things by hand by changing the tape speed, right? Make it all fit. That's the reverse guitar there. That became so overused in pop music at that time. How would you notate that? Those are sounds that you cannot get without the technology. You think about it, though, right? There was no piano in the 1600s. Piano came in, in the late 1700s? The first pianoforte. So before that, you had harpsichords and clavichords and pump organs. New technology, just that it was all mechanical. Saxophone was invented in the late 1800s by Adolphe Sax, I believe the guy's name was. There was no saxophone before that. That sound revolutionized the course of music, a saxophone, right? In America, and especially. You had all of this mechanical technology, right? In Bach's time, there were no valve horns. You'd have a horn tuned to a certain key, and it would be, they would be playing the overtones to get all the pitches. And then valves became a thing that helped change the way that a horn or a trumpet could play. That technology also then affected how the music was being written. You could write more virtuosic parts for trumpets, you could write higher pitched things on French horns and, possibly make sure that they actually are played properly. So technology has always advanced music. It's just that in our time, technology is now computer stuff, right? But back then, in the 60s, it was electronic stuff. It was tape. It was all sorts of, ways of manipulating things using physical tape. Let's listen to John's vocal a little bit in this.
Turn off your mind, relax and float downstream. It is not dying. Lay down all thoughts, surrender to the void. It is shining, it is shining. That you may see the meaning of within. It is being, it is being.
Now, what I want to do here is I want to play the guitar part of the solo. Right, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to separate this out, Command E, and then what I'll do is I'll go to Audio Suite, and then I will reverse this, and we can listen to it. Right? That sounds more like a regular guitar. A distorted guitar.